I started to recognize that not only am I codependent, but I've been codependent. Like, I grew up in a family of origin that was a breeding ground for codependency. And so the relationship that I chose in retrospect, right? Because everything that I've learned is in retrospect. In looking back, I could see so clearly, oh my gosh, that's why I chose the person that I chose. That's why I experienced all of these things.
You're listening to the Recovered Life Show, the show that helps people in recovery live their best recovered lives. And here is your host, Damon Frank.
Welcome back to the Recovered Life Show. I am here today with Dr. K.J. Foster, the founder and CEO of Fostering Resilience. Welcome to the show, Dr. Foster.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. I was so excited about this episode. I had a conversation with you last week, and we discussed your story and the book that you wrote about fostering resilience and the role of the family in recovery. And I'd like to just discuss that with you today because there were so many great little points that you brought up and that are in your book about the role of the family in addiction, the role of the person, the activities, everything. Why don't you dive in and tell us a little bit about your story and about how you came up with this?
Okay, well, it's a long story, so I'll try to make it as brief as possible. But as the result of my own personal recovery, I'm recovered for going on almost 13 years. It will be 13 years in July. And I also have a son who is recovered from a drug addiction. And prior to my own recovery and my son experiencing his addiction, I was married for over 17 years to someone who struggled with addiction, and codependency was probably my very first addiction that I experienced. So I went from this codependent relationship of trying to fix him, which of course didn't work, and it only made me sicker and the situation worse. So that ultimately led to the demise of that relationship. And then after that was when I myself started to, as a trauma of that whole experience, I started to struggle with my own drinking. And that was tied into also my son starting to experience and starting to dabble in his own drug use. So the codependency continued. And the codependency is really, I believe, was a significant factor in me becoming ultimately addicted to alcohol, because I just got sicker and sicker and sicker and started to turn to alcohol more and more. And so I got sober first. My son got sober when I was 14 months sober, and I learned so much as a result of that experience. And I decided ultimately when I was just shy of 2 years to change careers. And I already had a master's degree in mental health that I had never pursued, and decided I was going to go back to school, update my master's. Eventually, I went on to get my PhD, but I wanted to give back. I wanted to help others in a significant way. I mean, more so than just sponsoring other women. There was so much that I had learned about the role of the family that I thought that was a really important message to get out there.
When you mentioned the first sign that something was not right was the codependency. At the time, did you realize it was codependency, or did you just think, well, this is bad luck? Because a lot of people who, have addiction issues or in a family with addiction, they just think, well, it was just a bad set of circumstances.
Right. No, I had no idea. And that's the thing about codependency, and is that there's denial that comes into play. Some people are so codependent, and if you try to tell them that they're codependent, they will absolutely deny that they are in any way, shape, or form codependent. Mm-hmm. I myself had never heard of codependency. I didn't know until I was first getting sober, and my very first sponsor gave me the book, The Language of Letting Go, the Daily Reader. And I started reading that daily reader, and I was blown away. I identified so much with everything that she was talking about in this book. And that was the first exposure that I had to this concept of codependency. And from that point on, and learning and reading Melody Beattie's books, and I started to recognize that not only am I codependent, but I've been codependent. Like, I grew up in a family of origin that was a breeding ground for codependency. Yeah. And so the relationship that I chose in retrospect, right? Because everything that I've learned is in retrospect. And looking back, I could see so clearly, oh my gosh, that's why I chose the person that I chose. That's why I experienced all of these things. But it's the classic, we don't know what we don't know until we know it, right? And for me, it was there wasn't really any denial that was there. I was really grateful to learn, like, this is what my issue has been. This is why I've been suffering the way that I've been suffering, and started to learn ways in which I could start to heal that codependency. And so there is this denial that comes into play, at least with some family members that I've met. So I compare it to as being very similar to the substance use disorder experience, right? So, now we don't refer as often, or at least clinically, we don't refer to addiction, as alcoholism, as drug addiction. We refer to it as a substance use disorder, because it just, it's a better way of describing, because there are so many different variations, right? There's so many different characteristics that come into play, and it's diagnosed as mild, moderate, or severe. And so when we're talking about a severe substance use disorder, that's when we're really talking about like addiction, right? Because negative consequences are coming into play. I believe that codependency exists on the same type of a spectrum, like that. You could be mildly codependent, you could be moderately, or you could be severely codependent. And I am someone that became, over time, very severely codependent. And that's when we start to experience those progressive symptoms.
So a lot of people would say, just listening to your story and your, really, you have a lot of education and it's in this area, right? Yeah. A lot of people would say, well, did you just identify that? Did that make it easier for you? Because a lot happened for you in a short period of time. You get sober, you get this PhD, you then all of a sudden are dealing with a son that is going through addiction issues. What was going through your mind then?
Well, okay. So let me just back up for a minute so that it's clear to people that I didn't just like experience this and got my PhD and boom, I like know all this information. I was very fortunate. So my son and I, we went through a very traumatic, the divorce from my ex-husband was very traumatic for myself, for my two children at the time. And because I have three now, I'm remarried and we have three together. But at the time, it was a very traumatic experience. And my son, my oldest son, and I responded to it in very similar ways in terms of the reaching out for the substance. And so we were like parallel on our path of addiction. And I got sober first, and then he was able to get sober when I was 16 months sober. So that was all great. That was when he was 19 years old. He stayed clean and sober for about 6 or 7 years, and then experienced 2 relapses, and now is approaching at 31 years old, almost 4 years of recovery, solid, like better than ever. This is an example of where relapse is beneficial sometimes. You sometimes need to be able to look at your program. So besides that, I know I have a tendency to go off on these little tangents, but I'm getting there. Just wait for it.
I like it.
Trust me, wait for it. So when I decided to with the encouragement of my current husband, who I met in recovery at about 16 months sober. We started dating, and he encouraged me to go back to school and to pursue working in the field. And at the time, he was working in the field, and I had the opportunity to work at the treatment center where he was working as an intern. And so I went there as an intern, and right away, I was exposed to working with a gentleman named Terry Gorski. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He just passed away this year, unfortunately, but he is very well known in the field in that he specializes in relapse prevention. He wrote over 30 books on the subject of recovery, and I got to work with him. He taught me relapse prevention. I became advanced certified. We conducted groups together for over 2 years, and I immediately, aside from doing that work with him, I was thrown into working with families because of my experience, because of my own recovery, my son, and that experience. And so right away, I started working on a regular basis with other family members. So I have a ton of experience of meeting other family members and seeing, codependency right in front of me, at work, and helping them to learn the skills and the tools and the ways in which they can change in order to help their loved one to be successful. Because I think that there's such a critical key there, right? There's a critical key. Family members can make it harder, or they can contribute to success. And sometimes they're contributing to making it more difficult for their loved one, and they don't even have any idea that that's what they're doing.
Yeah. And I think, what would you say that the signs are that somebody is in a relationship or they're in a family situation and that they are codependent? Because, there is a lot of trauma when a family member is at the point where they're either admitting, or it's evident to everyone, because people that have addiction problems are really good at hiding things for long periods of time. Right. Typically. Mm-hmm. And then things blow up. And of course, people are going to be upset. Of course, there's going to be, it's going to kind of rock people's world. But How do you know? What are the signs that there is some underlying dysfunction there before that?
They're managing their loved one's life. They're managing their addiction. They're trying to manage their recovery if they've entered into treatment. And so, that is the definition of codependency. Codependency is when you are, in my opinion, in severe codependency, when you're addicted. You can use the word obsessed, but mm-hmm. when you are obsessed with controlling somebody else's life. So you're taking on responsibility for that person's life. You're taking on the responsibility for their substance use disorder. You're taking on the responsibility for their consequences. You're trying to manage their life for them instead of allowing them to manage their own life and being this autonomous, separate person that just supports when asked or when necessary. People that are codependent don't wait for somebody else to ask them for help. They jump in and help before, anybody even asks them to.
Well, I'd always heard that codependents needed alcoholics like alcoholics needed a drink. That there is this that there's this compulsion for them to rescue, fix, and make everything okay. Right. How do you see that playing out in a family? So when you're working with a family that has this, what are the steps that you take to try to unravel this? Because this seems so, I'm just going to use the term unmanageable. It seems like, what do you do? Because there's layers and layers and layers of dysfunction. Right. What's a step that people can take to kind of break out of this?
Right. Well, it starts with education, because really the awareness is the beginning, right? So many people have no idea that they're even codependent. They have no idea that these behaviors, and it's a pattern of behavior, right? It's a dysfunctional pattern of behavior. They have no idea no awareness that this is a problem. They think they're helping. They
Mhm.
think they're doing something good and positive. And, I want to just point out that there are so many different characteristics to codependency that I don't want somebody to think that, if you have these characteristics, that means there's such a, like substance use disorder, there's such a broad spectrum.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I will say, having said that, that there's some commonality. So it's common that if you grew up in a family of origin, right, where you were defined by what other people said and did, and like you weren't allowed to have your own thoughts, or how you felt was not validated or even allowed, for that matter, then you learned to identify yourself through the eyes of someone else. And I think this is where the pattern of behavior comes in, where you because this other person represents a part of you, then you get addicted to fixing that person. Because if you just fix that person, then then that ties into your own feeling of self-worth and self-esteem. And there's a lot of too there's a lot of guilt that comes into play with codependency. Like, for instance, maybe if you're a spouse or a parent, where you felt like you have these feelings, if you're just good enough, like you're not being a good enough parent, so you're trying to over help your loved one, and not realizing that overdoing, that over giving, that over anything, whether it's paying their bills or just getting them out of difficult situations, or making it easier for them. We make it easier for our loved one. We don't allow the
Mhm.
struggle. Like, I just did a video recently on the importance of the struggle. Like, it's so important to
Mhm.
allow your loved one to struggle. And that's the hard part of codependency, is when we're codependent, that uncomfortability of our loved one maybe um, not being happy with us, because we identify ourselves through the eyes of that person. And if they're angry with us or upset with us, then that's not comfortable. And so we avoid that discomfort by making
Yeah.
sure we're making everything okay with that person. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And one of the things that really kind of hits me when you talk about codependency is, it seems to me that recovering from codependency is almost more difficult than recovering from the substance,
Mm-hmm.
because these lines are very blurred. And if you don't have a real, a lot of people, obviously people who have been in recovery for some time know that not drinking or using drugs is not necessarily an indication of the best sobriety, right?
Right.
But you can at least gauge it by the fact that, well, I haven't used a substance today, right? Whereas
Mm-hmm.
codependency, I could see where you could easily be sucked up into codependency and not even realize it.
Right, right. It's one of those things that you really have to, at least for me, I have to keep out in front of me constantly, because I can fall back into old patterns of behavior. And it's true with, a substance use disorder, you can, because I don't buy into this, like, oh, you're forever powerless. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
personally, I don't. I consider myself recovered from my substance,
Yeah.
my functioning, my life, every aspect of my life is better than it ever
Mm-hmm.
was before. And I talk about in the Warrior's Guide to Successful Sobriety, this fourth level that you get to, that a lot of people don't ever try to reach, the emotional piece, the emotional
Yeah.
sobriety, that is so important. I think that's what really helps us to achieve that peace and that contentment, and all of those wonderful aspects of full and true recovery. And so there are plenty of people that are physically, recovered, physically abstinent, that are still angry and irritable
Mm-hmm.
and discontent, and that comes from the emotional piece. Codependency, on the other hand, is something that I believe you never fully recover from. I believe that for myself, if at least if you've reached the severe, if you've, I don't like to, I use the cross the line, so to speak,
Yeah.
Cucumber to the pickle, I think is the
Yeah.
analogy. Well, with codependency, once you've gotten to that severe level of codependency, there's just, it's always going to be there. And so my husband is somebody that is my accountability partner. And he'll say to me sometimes when he sees me doing things, he'll say, because I will with my son, I'll fall into doing things before he asks me, and he'll remind me, he'll say, did he ask you to do that? Like, you don't need to do that. Like, wait until he asks you. And if he asks you, then, provide help. And so I, even though I'm like way down that scale, I'm on the very mild end now, it's still there. And I think that's because of the, growing up in that family of origin where it's steeped like deep in the fiber of my being, and that's really hard to go from, that being such an ingrained part of who you are to just never experiencing codependency again. I just
But
don't think that.
I think the thing that's interesting though, and what's really refreshing about this is that you're saying that there is ways though that you can identify that you identify that more now. So you kind of see you've built a structure around you that will identify when you're in trouble or going down that path.
Right. Well, that's why, of course, CODA is so beneficial to so many people, is because there are plenty of people who are codependent who aren't in a relationship with somebody who has a substance use disorder. It used to be years ago, like 50 years ago, when, codependency first came about, this term codependent, which I think there's controversy as to like who came up with it, how it evolved, but it definitely has evolved over the years. It used to be somebody that was codependent was considered to be the person who's in a relationship with someone who's chemically dependent. They're the codependent. But we've come to realize, just like, we've realized so much about substance use disorders over the years, that you can be codependent and with somebody at work, with a friend. If you look at Melody Beattie's definition of codependency, which is the being obsessed with controlling somebody else's behavior, she doesn't refer to substance use disorders or anything in her definition, because the truth is you can be codependent with generally it's somebody who's needy, dependent, struggling, and you feel this need to help them or fix them or, taking over the responsibility of their life. That doesn't have to be somebody with a substance use disorder.
If you've been in recovery for a while, you kind of, I think it's a general understanding that people who are on the spectrum of codependency, let's say, that are very codependent and lean towards that way, are attracted to people who have substance abuse problems. A lot of the times it's almost a magnetic force, right? And the people who have substance abuse are attracted to people who are codependent.
Right.
And so it fits together like two pieces in a puzzle, right? And so it seems so right for them that is the way that it should be, but it's not. And I loved how you talked about it being inherited, and also this kind of next level with your Warrior's Guide of sobriety. And I say this a lot in my experience in sponsoring over several decades and coaching. What I find is that there's a lot of people that are stuck in recovery in what I call church basement thinking. They're sober. They are sober. They've even maybe done a 12-step program. They have a little bit of a network, but they haven't really taken the leap. They're still getting into bad relationships, always in conflict, not really able to have steady employment. And you can really see this by the people that they attract around them. And many of the people, it's because they are sober, but they've never dealt with their codependency issues.
Right. They've either not dealt with their codependency issues, or it's the emotional intelligence piece. They've not been able to address their inability to deal with uncomfortable emotions. They have the weak prefrontal cortex where the emotions completely override any level of intellect that is there. So this is where the emotional intelligence really, there's research studies out there that indicate that emotional intelligence above all else, above IQ, is the determinant of success, whether how successful you are as a human being. And you look at the way substance use disorders impact the prefrontal cortex, they impact the brain. And there are people that are born with weak prefrontal cortexes, and then you add substance use disorders to that, and there's no wonder that people can't handle their emotions. And that's, I think, aside from the codependency piece, I think that that is a big part for a lot of people. But I think it's just also there are a lot of people who don't have the ability to deal with their emotions in a healthy way. They're still acting out in ways that are hurtful towards themselves and towards others.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people watching this too that maybe identify it's like, oh, I really could go further with this emotional intelligence. And a lot of times in recovery, the next thing that they do is beat themselves up. And I think you would agree, right? That this is an unpacking. This is an unfolding. This happens over a period of time. This isn't going to happen your first year of sobriety necessarily. No. That just staying sober sometimes the first year or 2 years or 3 years and working little by little. I always call it's a 0.5% game, right? Just a little bit at a time. When you turn around years later, you will be pretty far down the road.
Right. Well, because if you know anything about post-acute withdrawals, which lasts an average of 18 months, sorry. 18 years would be a long time.
That would be a long time.
18 months average, right? So that means I would say nobody gets by with less than a year, right? Like it takes a year at least for the brain to heal. Some people it takes 2 to 3 years for the brain to fully heal. And so you're going to be experiencing those symptoms, that the stress and the irritability and the sleeplessness, that's going to come and go. So I think that the ability to really work on that emotional piece, the benefits that come from looking at ourselves in a way that most people are not willing to look at themselves because it's so uncomfortable. It's really hard. It's really hard to get honest with ourselves sometimes. And so some people just don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to do that uncomfortable work. So they just, they don't pick up the substance, but they're really not living to their full potential. They're really not maximizing the benefits of sobriety, because there are so many incredible benefits, but one of the most incredible for me has been this comfortability in my own skin, being able to deal with difficult emotions without, acting out toward harmful ways towards myself and other people, being able to sit with those difficult emotions and think through them and, and respond rather than react. And that takes time. That takes a lot of practice when you've been bombarding your brain with drugs and alcohol for so many years.
Well, this has been an amazing episode. I would like to thank you, Dr. Foster, for spending the time with us. Where can they find out more about you and your books?
On my website. So there are 2 ways to reach my website. They both go to the same spot, but you can go to www.drkjfoster.org, or you can go to www.frprogram, like fostering resilience, frprogram.com. And they can also, so my books are available on the website, but they're also available on Amazon and other local retailers as well.
Excellent. So they can go on to Amazon and purchase those books.
Yes.
Great.
Whatever's
Excellent.
most comfortable. If they purchase it through me on my website, the only thing that I say is that it might take a little longer. That's depending upon the day.
Exactly. Well, this has been a great conversation. We're also going to continue the conversation on recoveredlife.us, and we're going to put the contact information that Dr. Foster just mentioned there as well. Thank you so much. Been a great episode.
Thank you.
Keep the conversation going. Join Recovered Life, a community of like-minded people who are looking to live their best recovered lives. Membership is free, and you can apply at recoveredlife.us.